Now I'm going to turn our attention to AI and imaging for therapeutics and diagnostics, a session that will be led by Dr. Lisa Yen. Lisa has 15 years of experience in university administration and strategic research management in centres of excellence and collaborative research infrastructure. She's currently the Chief Executive Officer of Microscopy Australia. Will you please welcome to the stage Dr. Lisa Yen.
Hello everyone, and I'm delighted to be here with you all. Thank you for joining this session, both for those in person and also those online. My name's Lisa, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Microscopy Australia, which is one of those tricky words to say, and I think it's because we all want to say microscope, which has got a different stress to microscopy. But that is one of Australia's national collaborative research infrastructure projects that enables open access to advanced microscopes and amazing expertise at facilities that is located at universities around the country. As a member of the program committee, I hope you enjoy the themes and the sessions of the conference program and those networking opportunities. I'd also like to take the opportunity to invite you to visit the Stories and Structures New Connections exhibition that's in the foyer. It brings together the rich storytelling and image-making culture of our First Nations peoples, developing over 60,000 years and continuing today, with the scientific imaging created by advanced microscopes. We hope these images and these pieces of art will open new conversations and provide opportunities to make new and lasting connections. For those online, you don't have to miss out either, because you can search for the Stories and Structures collection online from the Microscopy Australia website. But now to this session. Our keynote presentation this morning will focus on some of those AI opportunities that we were just hearing about from an energy perspective, but turn to the ideas of imaging for innovative insights into next generation therapeutics and diagnostics. And I do hope that we will have that opportunity to have some questions from the audience, so I encourage you to think of your questions during James's presentation, which is now my honour to introduce Professor James Wistock. James completed his PhD in bioinformatics and structural biology at the University of Cambridge, and he is currently the Deputy Dean Research in the Faculty of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at Monash University. He's had a number of leadership roles in research, including an Australian Research Council or ARC Laureate and an ARC Federation Fellowship. He's also been the scientific head of EMBL Australia and the director of the ARC Centre of Excellence in Advanced Molecular Imaging. Over the course of his career at Monash University, he has contributed to the development of several key Monash research technology platforms, including the establishment of the Monash Ramaciotti Centre for Cryo-Electron Microscopy, which we were delighted to welcome into Microscopy Australia back in 2019. So please will you join me in warmly welcoming Professor James Wistock to the stage.
Hello, how do I go back? It's wonderful to be here, to see you all, and to, I guess, give you some thoughts, particularly from the Australian context, in regards to AI, imaging, and health. And so, I guess, the first thing I've got to say, because and I think there'll be many countries around the world where this resonates, is we are lagging behind in the context of AI research, I'm afraid. And the data is there. The data is there for anyone who wants to look at it. AI research in Australia attracted around 1% of grant funding from our National Health and Medical Research Council and Medical Research Future Fund over the last 5 years. So the other issue that we face is that of the 12 million, which is annually on average awarded into the sort of AI space, much of it goes to clinical teams that aren't internationally recognised as AI researchers. Now, that's nothing against these clinical teams. They're very, very great people. But and I'm in this place as well from a basic research perspective, The people who are essentially leading in particular spaces are not necessarily AI experts. So basically, transitioning these groups into the AI world is a real challenge, and it's a challenge that hopefully this audience will help address. If we look at our countries around the world, the UK, for example, I actually stopped calculating the amount of money that UK put into AI. There's so many different pots which are going into AI healthcare research, including investing in embedding AI into the NHS. The EU obviously has mammoth programs in this space. China is stepping up its investment in this area, aiming for 7% annual growth for R&D expenditure in this area, which is extraordinary. We have to, as a nation, and I think there'll be many other countries around the world that have the same issue, we have to look at this very carefully, because otherwise we're going to be in a world of haves and have-nots. If we look at if we look at clinical trials, 84 randomized clinical trial studies using AI, again published in the last 5 years. I'm afraid that none were conducted in Australia. That may have changed this year, but in that period, 0. The most active in this space are the United States, China, and of course, EU and its neighbours. And this is surprising from my perspective, because I know from my own university's point of view, Australia is a great place to do clinical trials. It's a fantastic place. It's got a good regulatory environment. It's got a connected health system, but it's not going to be that great if we don't basically address this. Now, this really surprised me until recently, actually. We are also, as a nation, apparently the most fearful of AI, which really surprised me until something happened. So I'm a structural biologist. I love using electron microscopes to solve protein structures. And in the middle of COVID, my colleague, Andrew Ellison, determined the structure of NF1, neurofibromatosis 1, which is one of the largest proteins encoded in the human genome. It's the most commonly mutated protein in childhood cancer. It forms this extraordinary sort of figure of 8 shape. And it was, by the way, it was sequenced by Francis Collins, who actually directed the NIH. Anyway, halfway through COVID, Andy gave me a ring and said, James, you've got to look at this AlphaFold model. It's just come online, and it's identical to my structure. And I went, come on. And I downloaded it, and I was like, oh, crap. And I've never felt this emotion before. On the one hand, I felt total depression. Total depression. In that I thought, well, I'm bloody useless now. I might as well give up and go home. Then I felt incredible excitement that this is a problem that I worked on in my PhD, the protein folding problem. It's been solved. We actually used the structure predicted by AlphaFold to help improve our cryo-EM model. I thought, what a wonderful opportunity. And then I felt fear about what happens if this thing gets into the wrong hands. I've never felt those three things together all at once. It was really, really strange. I'm a bit more excited now than fearful and depressed, it has to be said. All right, so that's just one small problem that AI is revolutionizing. Healthcare is one of the fastest and greatest growing industries in the world. How do we manage societal acceptance of AI in health? We have to think about ethical considerations. We have to think about data privacy and protection. We have to have the right regulatory frameworks. What about the ethics? We need to ensure that patients and clinicians are use these tools appropriately and support decision-making and autonomy of both the patients and the healthcare providers. There needs to be transparency and trust. We need to actually know what these tools can do and how to use them. I think it's incredibly important that we have fairness. Otherwise, whole swathes of the world will be left behind. We heard in the last session from First Nations peoples about their worries around essentially a lack of connectivity to the data that they own, and AI presents this as a challenge in its own right. And we need to have clear accountability. Data privacy and protection. Who owns the data? It's really important that people understand what their data is used for, how it is protected. We know that basically around the world, criminal gangs love to access healthcare data and hold it to ransom. There have been many very famous cases. On the other hand, and what's less well known, is that certain foreign governments also like to access healthcare data, except they prefer not to be seen when they do it, because they will be using it for other more nefarious purposes, blackmail over potential conditions that you may develop, framing people for certain crimes. And you think, is this beyond the realms of, is this fantasy? No, it is not fantasy. It is happening as we speak. The difference is that criminal gangs like to be seen because they're essentially hitting ransomware, whereas governments prefer just to gently collect data. And then we have organisations like 23andMe, where millions of people have taken a cheek swab and sent it into a company that they know nothing about because they want to know where they came from. That data, they have no control over that data anymore. That data has been bought by pharmaceutical companies and mostly, one hopes, being used for good things, like predicting genetic traits of disease and so on and so forth. But it's a very, very mixed world out there in the context of how we use this information. Above all else, though, from the perspective of the medical community, the patient consent is critical. They need to know what the data is being used for. People should also understand that sometimes consent isn't given. When you go into a hospital, governments typically collect data about people who have been admitted into hospital for the very good reason of improving our healthcare networks. And then, of course, around all of this is the need to put in place regulatory frameworks, and the Australian government is doing so across multiple departments to try to basically develop the appropriate framework to handle these challenging situations. Now, I found this very interesting. I'm going to give a few examples about biomedical imaging. I am not a biomedical imaging person. I am a structural biologist. I'm very happy to be a structural biologist as well. But when thinking about how people use biomedical imaging data, the steps, registration, synthesis, reconstruction, model prediction, segmentation and classification are actually equally applicable at the macro, large volume scale, but also at the nanoscale that Lisa and I work in. And so our instruments basically, we use segmentation, classification, and so on and so forth to understand cellular structure and structural biology. So the approaches across the AI world are actually for image analysis, are actually very similar. So what's the type of things that Australia is up to at the moment? Well, and people around the world. I think if you're a pathologist, it's a particularly interesting time because analysing imaging is one of the things that AI is really, really, really good at. And so I think it's fantastic that basically our ability to predict and stage, for example, cancer is going to be far better with the application of the appropriate AI engines. But also we need to think about things like aged care. People who get old get lonely because everyone around them dies. And that's unfortunate. I remember my grandmother saying it to me. She goes, James, I'm 92 and all my friends are dead. I was like, oh, Christ, okay. But yes. We can use AI technology to improve companionship for elderly people. We can use it for GP visits so that GPs can spend less time writing up notes. We can use it to basically improve clinical decisions. When you consider immunotherapy, particularly in the context of blood cancers, the number of different immunotherapeutic drugs that are out there is absolutely enormous. So thinking about how you actually apply the correct combination to a person's individual disease situation is extremely complex indeed. We can use chatbots, we can use it to guide surgery, we can use it for skin checks, and I'll come on to that, to basically analyse medical records, but also, I think most excitingly of all, in hypothesis generating, in deploying AI to deliver testable hypotheses for the medical community. This is really interesting, potential connectivity that human beings cannot detect. So I'm going to give a few examples. Unfortunately, 2 in 3 Australians will develop a form of skin cancer by the age of 70. One of the hotspots for melanoma is Brisbane. Another hotspot is over in Perth. Our lifestyle and our geographic location means we are very susceptible to this terrible disease. This means that 1 in 3 Australians, that's a third of the population, get their skin checked every year. I bet if I had a poll in this room, most of the Aussies would put their hands up and say, yeah, I get my skin checked. Now imagine the burden that places on the health system. We also merrily cut bits off people. And that's not so good if you're the person having bits cut out of, and then it turns out that it's not a melanoma and you didn't need to have it cut out and you've got a great big hole in your arm or leg or something like that. Bad news. So can we use AI to improve diagnosis? The answer is yes, we can. The Australian Centre of Excellence for Melanoma Imaging and Diagnostics has a network of 3D body imaging machines across Australia, combined with the appropriate genetic and pathology reporting and the right, libraries of digital images. You can actually basically start to use AI to automate the process of standard of diagnosis for melanoma, and to stratify people in the context of their risk, and to make sure the right people see the right medical provider at the right time. And eventually, and there's already sort of versions of this out there, but eventually on a formal perspective, this technology could be adapted so you'll be able to scan your body with your own phone. We know that MRI, the type of instruments that are under the National Imaging Facility with Wojtek Kaczynski's NCRIS capability, these are very large, difficult to basically house instruments. There are portable versions, but they're not as accurate. We can use AI to basically improve artificially improve the resolution of images, MRI brain images taken using low-resolution data sets, thus improving accessibility of this technology to the wider population. This is particularly important in Australia. We're a huge country, and not everyone lives near near an MRI centre. Similarly, also using MRI, our ability to treat complex, difficult to treat conditions such as multiple sclerosis, where there's multiple different therapeutics, and developing an individualized patient care plan, again, will be greatly improved using AI-based approaches. And then some of the diseases that cause huge social stigma, things like sexually transmitted infections, where basically people avoid getting diagnosed. This causes massive problems, particularly, again, in less well-advantaged communities. We can develop apps and AI-driven models in order to risk check people for their likelihood of contracting disease, and also in the context of helping them obtain a provisional diagnosis and most importantly, to seek the appropriate treatment in a timely fashion. Lastly, in terms of classic medical imaging, we can use it in the context of difficult to treat and/or difficult to detect fractures, particularly in the context of hand and foot fractures, where basically often it's very difficult to see the fracture and to identify the best form of treatment going forward. And one's hands and feet are rather important for quality of life. Now, moving away from classic imaging, I've got 2 more slides. I just want to say 2 last things. When people talk about the changing climate, they often say, oh yeah, and you know what, speciation's changing, the birds are going away, different birds are coming, I can't catch my favourite fish anymore. It affects species a lot. It also affects us because they don't necessarily identify as being a species, an animal. And we are going to be hammered by the changing climate. And this study, for example, published in Nature by my colleague Yumin Gao last year, demonstrated that bushfire smoke, and we're living in the centre of one of the greatest bushfire countries in the world, accounts for over 6 million extra deaths per year. If anyone has been, for example, for certain cities in Southeast Asia during the burning season, the air is unbreathable, and it's estimated that you lose 6 years of your life if you live there. we need better ways of mitigating this issue and basically and trying to improve people's quality of life in the context of air quality. Lastly, from my perspective, I had to put a picture of a Titan up because Lisa, this is part of Microscopy Australia and I love my microscope. But biologists are moving into a petabyte scale world. Now, I spoke to an astronomer who I won't name for a worry of embarrassing him, but a very renowned astronomer. And I said very proudly to him, biology is moving into big data. And he looked at me, he said, James, you don't have a clue what big data is. You know, go and play with my radio telescope. That'll give you big data. I went, oh, okay, and I sort of went away a little bit, put back in my box, which is fair enough. But we are entering a world and the basic biomedical research where we routinely in tomography are producing high terabyte stroke petabyte scale data sets. And then if we look at these quadrupeds, which are springing up around the globe, this is one of Wojtek's instruments in New South Wales. Imagine a real-time body movie in PET, how much data is being produced there. It is ginormous. So basically, and then we're also living in a world where many of the infrastructure people in this audience will be looking in rather worriedly at their bit of kit that they just invested maybe a few $1 million in and is about to be basically made redundant. For example, in the context of antibody design or in the context of protein design, we are in a very fast-changing world where today's $100 million investment could be kind of out of whack in less than 18 months' time. We've just got to get used to that and work out how to deal with it and maximize the utility of our infrastructure. So, are we ready? Do we have the compute? Probably not. Well, somewhere we have it, although I was actually relieved to hear a colleague from NASA saying that they even struggle with these type of issues. So we need to think about how we share and utilize the right compute at the right time for these major problems. Do we have the people? And this is, I think, the biggest problem of all. How can we work together to train our workforce? And this is where I hope, from an Australian perspective, that our connectivity with Europe and the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, ELIXIR and colleagues in and around the world in terms of their experiences of data, establishment of marrying together disparate, communities that have the same problems, which the NCRIS Health Group here in Australia is bringing together really interesting people who don't do the same thing, but have shared ambitions and shared desires and shared needs in the context of training. I think nationally and internationally, this type of meeting is going to be fundamental for it. And with that, I will finish and say thank you so much for your time. All right, okay.
Opportunity for questions.
Cool.
So as promised, we do have some minutes now before our lunch break for some questions. So I'm going to perhaps start with one myself, but for anyone who is interested in asking a question, please indicate, and there are some microphones that can come to you. So should we sit?
Yeah, I'll sit.
Maybe that's a bit more fun. So I guess, one of the things that you've talked about there is how to sort of enable those opportunities for collaboration, and you've mentioned some of the people, but I wanted to come back a little bit perhaps to the data question, because those issues of standards and qualities and multi-site and, clinical trials really do depend on high quality and standardised data. And I wondered if you had any thoughts or reflections on your experience of how to enable that.
Yeah.
Should be on.
Is that
Yes,
brilliant?
now you're right.
All right, the data issue, it's just huge. It's really, if two people have two different types of instrument, they'll generally have different metadata, different structures. Getting, for example, health systems to talk to one another is really challenging. And Australia is actually a really good place for this. But it is a big problem. Even more so privacy. You know, you can't just start banging people's data up into the cloud, health data into a cloud, and sort of it disappears and you don't know where it is. Health networks have very serious and quite rightfully so, rules about what you can and cannot do with their data. So how we basically deal with, standardize, and ensure that different systems can communicate with others is extremely important. And requires people to actually get organised and sit down and go, right, this is going to be an international standard. The structural biology community did this really well with the protein data bank, and the way that basically millions of structures are reported in that is available for all. The same is not true for many other systems, so it's going to be tough. But I think it's going to require the right type of people to get together and deal with a problem that not everyone's fascinated in. You know, that's the other issue. Some people don't want to talk about it, not interested. They want to do big, fluffy things, or other things.
Yeah. Did we have any questions? Yes, just here at the front.
So as it was interesting you started out by saying there's very little money going to do AI in Australia, but then you mentioned a huge number of cases where where AI is being used. So how is that being funded? And my second question is, are you building sort of foundational models, and how do you deal with sort of, a security to keep the data, to red team the AI models so that the data doesn't go into the larger ether?
So, two very good questions. So the answer to the first is people are just doing it because they know that they're going to be left behind. So there are basically people are finding a way, even in the context of limited funding in the space. But we are facing really serious challenge, particularly with things like the quadruped. I mean, we've just bought a quadruped. I mean, when that thing lands, I mean, I'm going to have a Wojtek, hopefully it's somewhere here, but we're going to have a talk about how we actually handle the stuff coming out of this, because I think it's going to be really, really difficult. I do feel that, programs like Train the Trainer, which by the Australian Biocommons and Bioplatforms Australia have essentially pioneered, we have brought a lot of expertise into the country. So we're becoming more sort of familiar with how to use this information, but we're not there yet. And I think it's going to really require, I personally think, it is going to require a lot more intersection between our computer science educators and our medical professionals, such that we can have people like nurses who can code. These wonderful innovations are only any use if anyone actually knows how to use it. If you put a bit of kit in a hospital that no one understands how to use, it will rapidly get thrown out. So I think that, and your last question in terms of data security, again, this is something that just needs to be done with enormous care, and it cannot fail. It really cannot fail.
We've got a question over here.
Yeah, thanks very much. You mentioned the question of whether we have the compute. Sorry, you mentioned the question of whether we have the compute and whether we have the people. I'm also interested in whether we actually have the language for some of this, because I'm concerned. I mean, even today, we've been talking about AI a lot as if it's something somewhat monolithic. Do we have enough understanding about the areas in which we need to invest? And do we, particularly at a time of, I suppose, global hype around AI as a thing generally, do we have the ability to articulate clearly what it is we're planning on doing and how we're going to do it? Really great question. I mean, number one, the problem with these type of engines is they're only as good as what they are trained upon. And that actually also has an issue in that basically whole sectors of society can be left out if they're not in the training set. And that's a problem. So and accordingly, and you think about medical records and medical data,
ethnicity of patients and so on and so forth, what works for one person's cultural heritage won't work for another. So there are big challenges here in terms of literally how we basically decide what data we use to train a particular engine. I do think it's a hugely exciting field in that it's changing fast, but we can see with like ChatGPT, the Google related engines, that they sometimes go very badly wrong. And so, yeah, I think that we need to plan and to consider, well, okay, you know, do we actually have the tools in place for things like image analysis? Because of history, I mean, these type of Markov models, for example, I think were developed initially for military purposes during the Vietnam War. So they've been used on images for many, many, many decades. But there are other sets of data that sort of haven't been encountered. So, like, yeah, I think we've got to look at that.
All right, thanks. I think we've got time for one more question, and then I would encourage you to continue discussing with each other over lunch. Thanks.
Yes, thanks. Well, of course, trustworthy artificial intelligence has to do with algorithms being in the hands of the scientific community, so designing and understanding what they do, and being trained on high-quality data, again, recognized by the community. But coming to a point that you mentioned on the privacy in the medical sector, clinical research, how do you expect that trustworthy synthetic data on particular, you know, pathological tissue or things like that can be the real information that is transferred, and that is not anonymized, it's just built on statistics of similar real samples and becoming a reference for clinical practice? So
I think that requires a really close intersection of the medical professional with the data. So what makes people very uncomfortable, and it certainly makes me uncomfortable, is if you've got an AI system essentially taking over and that there's no human being, if you like, is making the decision about treatment. So I think one of the first and most important thing is that a data set is, if you like, curated because the appropriately trained person is looking at it and making a decision. So, for example, in Victorian Heart Hospital, when you enter into the hospital, if you have a cardiac event, AI-based engines will help advise the clinician on a particular course of action. They can take, though, whatever decision the patient and the consents to, obviously, and that their own clinical skill set basically comes into play. The interesting thing is when, of course, there's no advantage of one treatment over another, then that person, if they can consent, can automatically be put into an adaptive clinical trial. These are really, really powerful clinical trials. So things like REMAP-CAP for community-acquired pneumonia, which was running before COVID. When COVID hit, it was adapted for COVID. Now that trial produced more actionable evidence to treat COVID-19, the disease, not to prevent, to treat, than Operation Warp Speed. So these things, when appropriately directed, can be extraordinarily powerful, but they do need the intervention and guidance of the appropriate expert as well. I think that's the summary.
Yeah. All right, well, will you please join me in thanking James, and let's hand back over to our MC.